Hello and welcome to Campus Invisibility. I am your host, Emily Greenwell, and I am so happy that you're here today. Our first episode of our series, Campus Invisibility, which will discuss the impacts of underrepresentation and discrimination, while simultaneously offering ways to combat these injustices and make college campuses more inclusive and welcoming to everyone, which is one of the reasons why this podcast is a great outlet for university faculty and students to utilize. Now, I expect that many of you listening have some kind of a connection or role within a university. Whether you are a student, professor, or even a university president, you have a duty and a responsibility to ensure diversity, inclusion, and representation within campuses. Students, you are the ones who can make the most change at the social level, increasing feelings of belonging, equality, and inclusion. Faculty members, you are the ones with the power to enact change and implement programs to create a more diverse and inclusive campus. In this episode, we will be focusing on students with disabilities, particularly examining past and present-day discriminations against people with disabilities, how those exclusions and barriers impact our campuses today, the impact these barriers and exclusions have on the mental health of students with disabilities, and how we can combat these injustices and create a more loving and inclusive environment. I wanted to begin by giving a brief overview of the discrimination faced by people with disabilities in order to promote a more well-rounded understanding of the current discrimination students with disabilities face and why this discrimination persists. According to the Southern Adrian Act Independent Living, evidence of discrimination against people with disabilities can be traced back to ancient Greece and Rome. Both societies were enthralled by the idea of human perfection, which is evident through the idealistic depictions of people in the arts and literature. As a result of this, people with disabilities were extremely discriminated against and virtually disregarded in society. They viewed disabilities as a mark of God's wrath and were encouraged to kill any child born with disabilities, which devastatingly and heartbreakingly became the norm. Beginning in the Middle Ages, many people chose to either abandon their children with disabilities or send them to early forms of what would be now institutions, where they would be hidden from society. And this practice continued well into the 20th century. The idea that people with disabilities were inherently evil also persisted, allowing for the continued feelings of fear and hatred in society to persist. Beginning in the 20th century, immigration laws were put in place to deny entry to people with disabilities within the United States and to prevent them from even going out in public. Freak shows depicting people with disabilities became more and more prominent, resulting in further dehumanization and discrimination against people with disabilities. People with disabilities also were continued to be sent to institutions and quote-unquote special schools in order to separate them from society. All these discriminations, unfortunately, have contributed to discriminatory modern-day perceptions of people with disabilities, which is why they are so important to address. So important to address. The presence of discrimination against people with disabilities has persisted for thousands of years, and that ultimately has a huge impact on our society and has led to the continued discrimination and intense exclusion. Society, thankfully, has become more and more aware of the errors and horrors of its past, particularly since the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act in 1990, which definitely made a significant impact and progress in providing legal protections for people with disabilities, increasing inclusion and representation in many aspects of life, including university life, and making the world more physically accessible. Many of these people still face intense discrimination and exclusion, particularly those with evident physical disabilities. The multitude of preconceived notions and stereotypes society has instilled into our minds has created a disconnect between able-bodied people and people with disabilities. This immense lack of representation in things such as the classroom and literature also furthers the separation able-bodied people have from people with disabilities. If we were to address the lack of representation, primarily within the education system and within college campuses, we could reshape the perceptions people have towards disabilities, ultimately creating a more loving and equitable society. Feelings of exclusion are far too common for students with disabilities on college campuses. One way this is evident is through the low quality or just lack thereof of physical accommodations, such as ramps, elevators, door handles, etc. Even after the passage of the ADA, which provides physical accommodations for people with disabilities to ensure their accessibility into government-funded buildings, many college campuses lack the funding to ensure the highest quality resources to make these campuses more accessible, oftentimes leading to a lack of disability-friendly dorm rooms, inadequate wheelchair ramps, and outdated elevators, ultimately continuing the treatment of people with disabilities as second-class citizens. To Donna Carpenter, the head coordinator for the Kentucky Deafblind Project, quote, environmental physical things such as ramps or access to buildings or access to information is always an add-on. I find when you look at a building, ramp or access to a building is thought of at a later date, and I would hope, since we are in 2020, that we will be designing buildings with universal design so that anyone can come and go there, and that there are no barriers for people who are disabled. It is important to figure out what barriers there are and how to tear them down and make a more universal design so that anyone can participate in them. End quote. I believe that Donna Carpenter really does make an excellent point in kind of showcasing the fact that these ramps or this accessibility to buildings are typically just a second thought and not even intended in the original design of buildings. And that just showcases the fact that people with disabilities are so ignored within our society, and they just experience, like, life as a second-class citizen. I mean, universities and administrations everywhere have a responsibility in ensuring pristine and accessible accommodations for their students with disabilities. Without these accommodations in place, students with disabilities may not only feel socially isolated from their peers, but they may even experience a multitude of physical barriers that prohibit them from fully engaging in campus life. According to a study conducted by the U.S. National Library of Medicine, most students are not even aware of the existing facilities and accommodations, and they are often neglected in terms of supported structures and resources. Students with disabilities have a right to access special facilities to successfully facilitate their learning experience at universities, and the awareness of existing facilities must be emphasized and raised in order to offer equal opportunities and enable a sense of seamless inclusion. These physical and social barriers found on college campuses hinder students with disabilities' ability to succeed and equally participate in campus life. Unfortunately, many universities not only have physical exclusions that prevent a student with disabilities from succeeding to the fullest, but also social exclusions, which can have a detrimental impact on students' mental health and their ability to succeed. Our society is severely undereducated regarding the discrimination people with disabilities face, and oftentimes, many non-disabled people never even interact with people with disabilities. This lack of connection and understanding allows for negative stereotypes and perceptions to persist, increasing the internalized hatred and fear within the non-disabled. As able-bodied college students age and become more involved in society, they need to know about the impacts of exclusion and have a deeper understanding of their own ableism. If these internalized biases are not addressed, the cycle of exclusion and trauma will persist, creating a lowered sense of self-worth and belonging for many students with disabilities. This cycle of exclusion is seen through people like Anne Catherine Heigl, a woman with Down syndrome. At her time at George Mason University, Heigl applied to every sorority on campus, but was rejected by all of them due to her disability, leaving her feeling devastated, excluded, and worthless. Unfortunately and heartbreakingly, Heigl's experience is not unique, and this issue originates from a long lack of inclusion and educational opportunities regarding students with disabilities. We as a society also need to recognize the traumatic impact that social exclusion and rejection can have on students with disabilities, ultimately impacting their academic performance, experience, and sense of self-worth. The deprecation and one's feeling of self-worth is seen within a recent study conducted by the U.S. National Library of Medicine. This study found that students with disabilities have lower life satisfaction than their non-disabled peers, particularly due to the discrimination and exclusion they face. However, those who feel a strong sense of belonging in their community do not have a lower life satisfaction, even if they experience a lot of discrimination. This shows us that an environment of belonging and inclusion is key for the well-being of students with disabilities, and that a sense of belonging can offset the negative consequences of discrimination. I mean, a person goes to university to experience university life in its fullest, from dorm life to sorority life to academics and football games. It is vital for a person to feel represented and included in these situations in order to create a sense of belonging, which we just learned can have a massive positive impact on their mental health. That is why it's essential that we as students should encourage kindness and inclusivity in order to make campuses a safer and more inclusive environment for students with disabilities, and why professors and faculty members should be made aware of incidents related to discrimination and should be active in combating these injustices. I mean, students enter college with a sense of vulnerability and place large amounts of trust in their friends and professors in the hopes that they will foster and grow their knowledge, passions, ambitions, like everything. And if that trust is betrayed and students do not feel welcomed or they don't experience that wonderful sense of belonging and inclusion on campus, that can have such a detrimental impact on their mental health and just cause so many negative consequences within their life. And that's why it's so important that we, in a position of power, can help to speak out against these issues and to fight these issues and to say, hey, we can't allow this to persist. We have to combat this, and we have to address these issues and create real programs and initiatives that will ultimately make our society a more understanding and equitable place. I think a great way to kind of combat the lack of belonging and inclusion that many students with disabilities face is, at the beginning, at least, to simply increase diversity within college campuses, particularly in places of power and authority. And this can be seen both at the administrative level and at the student level, from sorority positions for undergraduate students to implementing a more diverse faculty and implementing new positions within every single college and program within the university to ensure that people with disabilities' voices are being heard and that they're getting the representation that they deserve as members of society. Another great way to combat these exclusions and discriminations is to implement new core classes in which students will learn about the history of discrimination against people with disabilities, the current discriminations that they face, and how to combat any further discrimination and exclusion. These classes would showcase works of art, literature, history, created by people with disabilities, in order to gain a more accurate representation and knowledge of all the things, the overall experience of a person with disabilities. It would be so important for these classes to be taught by professors with disabilities in order to gain a more insightful and personal knowledge of these issues. This would offer students a unique perspective while simultaneously creating more jobs for people with disabilities, which would ultimately have a positive impact on the professors physically, mentally, and socially, and have a positive benefit through the diversification of the faculty at the university. It would be important for a mentorship or kind of volunteer aspect to occur within the course, which could be seen through activities such as college students going to schools around their communities, particularly schools with children with disabilities or schools in lower income areas, and introducing teachers and students to works of art or literature that represent people with disabilities. UK students could read books to children such as You Can Do So Many Things by the University of Kentucky professor Kathy Shepard-Jones, who herself has a disability. She was inspired by her own experience to write a children's book, and this book provides a rare kind of representation, and if taught in schools, particularly at the elementary level, it would allow for children with disabilities to appreciate the limitless potential and intelligence that they possess and increase their self-confidence and self-worth, even if people around them or they themselves label their disabilities or any hardships in life that they face as restrictive or hindering to their success. It would also allow non-disabled children to ultimately connect with their peers with disabilities, which would create a more loving and equitable society. This class would not only provide the necessary and vital knowledge able-bodied students would need in fostering a more equitable society and understanding their own privilege and their own power, but it would also open up people's hearts and create so many new relationships and connections between college students and children, which would ultimately have a deeper societal benefit, allowing for generations of students to, one, learn about the experiences of people with disabilities for the older students to teach that and kind of learn about it through that aspect, and it would allow younger students to learn and be introduced to that knowledge, which would ultimately allow us to raise a society where those discriminations, at the very least, are not that prominent, and we are more open-hearted and loving and have a deeper understanding. In order to tackle the multiple generations of discrimination and lack of representation experienced by people with disabilities, it is vital that we acknowledge the discriminations, both past and present, faced by people with disabilities, listen to suggestions and demands of these students and faculty members, and implement the suggestions that I have discussed above. We must first implement the discussion of historical events and works of literature regarding people with disabilities into our college campuses at all levels. This will introduce students to a long history of suffering, discrimination, and exclusion people with disabilities have faced, and it will cause students to recognize their own internalized ableism, recognize their own privilege, while simultaneously creating a deeper sense of kindness and understanding within them. We must also listen to the multitude of perspectives and opinions people with disabilities have, particularly since it's incredibly important for us to recognize the humanity of everyone around us. I believe that if we continue to further integrate schools with students with disabilities, rather than continue the practice of separating students, increase disability support on college campuses, begin to teach students works of literature and history lessons where people with disabilities are portrayed, and have a more diverse faculty and administration on college campuses, we will be able to achieve a more loving and equitable society. Thank you so much for tuning in to Campus Invisibility. I hope you learned some valuable information and new ways to implement anti-discriminatory practices into your life. I hope you have a spectacular and wonderful day, and remember to always be kind to each other.